November 26, 1857. Thanksgiving night. In a torchlit carriage house in Arkansas, 40 of the South's most powerful men watched a slave lift impossible weight until he refused one final command. What happened next sounded like a dry branch breaking in the wind. Only it wasn't a branch. It was the master's neck. And every witness swore the strength that did it was not human. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves that November. The Arkansas River moved slow and black past the cypress knees, carrying the scent of distant rain and the heavier, sweeter rot of cotton bolls left too long in the field. In the bottomlands south of Little Rock, the Rutled plantation lay like a white island in a dark green sea. Its Greek revival mansion glowing under the moon, columns tall as judgment, windows lit with the soft gold of whale oil lamps. Inside those walls, laughter rose and fell like music. Outside, 200 souls listened to that laughter and waited for morning, the way men on death row wait for the footsteps of the guard. But on this Thanksgiving night in 1857, something older than the plantation, older than the river itself, was waking up. They would later say the first sign was the dogs. Every hound on the place began to howl at dusk, low, mournful, as if mourning something that had not yet died. The overseers cursed and cracked their whips, but the dogs would not be silenced. Even the old house hounds, fat and lazy from years of table scraps, crawled under the veranda and refused to come out. In the slave quarters, an old woman named Aunt Rachel, who claimed to remember the middle passage in the bones of her dreams, sat on an overturned bucket and rocked, back and forth, back and forth. She spoke to no one in particular, but every child within earshot heard her words. The Lord done sent a Samson among us, and Pharaoh gone learn tonight what happened when you try to weigh the wind. No one corrected her. They all knew who she meant. His name on the bill of sale was simply Samson. No sernam, no traive. No age anyone could prove. The Louisiana Frenchman who sold him in 1854 had scrawled a warning beneath the price.
Possède une force contre nature. Vendu tel quel. Acheteur assume tout risque.
Possesses a strength against nature. Sold as is. Buyer assumes all risk. Colonel Jeremiah Rutled had smiled when he read it. He liked risk. He liked anything that could be measured, catalogued, and eventually broken. Rutled was not born to plantations. He was born to Boston cobblestones and Harvard lecture halls. Son of a shipping merchant who lost everything in the Panic of 1837. Jeremiah came south with one carpetbag, a law degree, and a hunger that scared even his own mother. By 1857 he owned 3,000 acres of the richest soil in Pulaski County, a mansion copied line for line from a plate in Minard Lefever's pattern book, and a private library full of phrenology journals, Scottish Enlightenment treatises, and, hidden behind a false panel, well-thumbed copies of de Sade and Voltaire that no Baptist neighbor ever saw. He ran his plantation the way other men ran factories, with ledgers, stopwatches, and the cold glee of a man who had discovered that human flesh could be made to behave like iron, if you applied enough science. He weighed babies at birth. He measured the circumference of skulls. He kept a breeding schedule pinned above his desk like a railroad timetable. And in the margin of one ledger, in his neat attorney's hand, he had written, "If the Negro is a separate species, then variation must exist as it does in horses and dogs. I intend to find the limit of that variation, even if I must break the specimen to do it." That specimen now lived in a corner cabin near the blacksmith's shed, apart from the other men. Samson, 6'4" in a time when most men scraped 5'8". Shoulders so wide the doorway had to be widened when he moved in. Skin the color of river silt after a storm, scarred in places with marks no whip had made, long, deliberate ridges that almost looked like writing. His hands were the thing people could not stop staring at. Palms broad as dinner plates, fingers thick yet strangely graceful, covered in callus so old and dense it had the dull sheen of horn. When he closed those hands, the knuckles made a sound like green wood thrown on a fire. The other slaves loved and feared him in equal measure. Children followed him like ducklings. Old men asked his blessing before they died. Women dreamed about him and woke up praying. But no one, not even Jupiter the blacksmith, who had known him longest, claimed to truly know him. Late at night, when the overseers were drunk and the dogs finally quiet, Samson could be seen sitting outside his cabin, firelight flickering across his face. He never whittled or smoked or told stories like the other men. Instead, he drew in the dirt with a stick, long, flowing lines that looked sometimes like Greek, sometimes like Arabic, sometimes like nothing any living soul had ever seen. When anyone approached, he smoothed the ground with one pass of his huge palm, and the symbols vanished like breath on a mirror. Jupiter once asked him, "What you writin', brother?" Samson answered without looking up. "The weight of things." That was all. Colonel Rutled's fascination began as science and curdled into obsession. It started innocently enough, a wager at the Planters Club in Little Rock. Rutled claimed he owned a slave who could outwork any 3 men in the county. The bet was accepted. Samson picked 1,800 pounds of cotton in a single day, nearly double the best recorded yield, and never once asked for water. Word spread up and down the river like yellow fever. Soon carriages began arriving uninvited. Men in frock coats and silk waistcoats, clutching brandy snifters, wanting to see the marvel for themselves. Rutled, ever the showman, turned the old carriage house into a private theater of cruelty. Torches in iron sconces, sawdust on the floor to soak up blood and sweat, a chalkboard for recording times and weights. Samson would stand in the center, shirtless, silent, while Rutled narrated like a circus barker. Observe the deltoid development, unprecedented in the Negro race. Note the absence of fatigue toxins even after 4 continuous hours. Now, gentlemen, we shall test the ultimate compressive strength of the metacarpals. They made him bend cold iron bars until the metal screamed. They timed how long he could hold a 300-pound anvil at arm's length. Once, for the amusement of a visiting Prussian baron, they chained his ankles and ordered him to drag a fully loaded cotton wagon 50 yards. He did it without the chains so much as creaking. Each time, Rutled scribbled in his journal, eyes shining with the fervor of a man who believed he was dissecting God's own blueprint. But something else was happening in those torchlit nights, something Rutled's instruments could not measure. Every time Samson performed, a stillness came over the other slaves watching from the shadows. They did not cheer. They did not cry out. They simply watched, heads bowed, lips moving in prayers no white man could hear. And Aunt Rachel would whisper the same words, over and over, like a drumbeat only they could feel. The Lord ain't forgot Egypt, and he done sent a deliverer. By the fall of 1857, the demonstrations had grown darker. Rutled had begun speaking openly about terminal thresholds. He wanted to know exactly how much punishment a human frame could take before it failed. He wanted to publish his findings in the American Journal of Medical Science under the title, "On the Absolute Limits of Muscular Hypertrophy in the African." He wrote letters to colleagues in Charleston and New Orleans. "I believe I am on the verge of proving that the Negro organism possesses a capacity for physical stress far beyond the Caucasian, perhaps as much as 40% greater. One final series of trials, conducted without restraint, should provide conclusive data." The house servants, those invisible angels who dusted the study and emptied the chamber pots, read those letters when Rutled left them on his desk. They carried the words back to the quarters the way they carried scraps to the dogs. Samson listened without comment. But the children noticed he had stopped drawing symbols in the dirt. Now he only stared at the mansion, hour after hour, as though memorizing every window, every chimney, every brick. And his eyes, those deep, terrifyingly calm eyes, had begun to shine with something that looked less like rage and more like sorrow. Thanksgiving week arrived with frost on the grass and wood smoke hanging low in the air. Rutled planned his grandest spectacle yet. 43 guests, oysters shipped on ice from Baltimore, a 12-piece orchestra from Memphis, and as the centerpiece of the evening, after the brandy and the cigars, the final demonstration. He wrote in his journal on November 25th, "Tomorrow the specimen will either validate my life's work or perish in the attempt. Either outcome is acceptable to science." That night, the dogs began howling again. Only this time, they did not stop when the whips fell. In the big house, crystal glittered. Laughter rang against the high ceilings. Outside, the enslaved moved like ghosts, setting tables, filling lamps, polishing silver that would never belong to them. And in his cabin, Samson knelt. Not in submission, not in fear. He knelt the way Moses knelt before the burning bush. Head bowed, palms open, lips moving soundlessly. Jupiter, passing by with an armload of firewood, heard only one phrase, repeated like a heartbeat. If I am the rod you have chosen, then let the river turn to blood. At dawn on November 26, 1857, the sky over Rutled Plantation was the color of a fresh bruise. A cold front was moving in from the northwest, and the wind carried the smell of iron. Samson rose before the horn. He washed his face in the horse trough, the water so cold it burned. Then he walked to the blacksmith shed where Jupiter already had the forge glowing. Without a word, Samson picked up a horseshoe, cold iron, fresh from the anvil, and bent it into a perfect circle with his bare hands. The metal groaned like a dying thing. Jupiter dropped his hammer. Samson placed the ruined shoe back on the anvil and spoke for the first time in days. "Today," he said, voice soft as falling ash. "The book's close." Then he walked toward the big house to begin setting up the veranda for the feast, moving with the calm, terrible purpose of a man who has already seen how the story ends. High on the mansion's widow's walk, Colonel Jeremiah Rutled stood in his dressing gown, sipping coffee and watching the giant figure cross the yard. He felt a thrill he could not name, equal parts triumph and something that might have been fear if he had allowed himself to recognize it. He raised his cup in a silent toast. "To science," he whispered. Far below, Samson paused in the middle of the lawn. He looked straight up at the colonel, across 200 feet of frostbitten grass, and raised one massive hand. Not in greeting, not in threat, in promise. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Jeremiah Rutled felt the coffee turn to gall in his mouth. Because the eyes looking back at him were not the eyes of a slave. They were the eyes of a reckoning. The crack still echoed when the sun came up. It was a thin, pale light that slid over the frost-covered cotton fields on November 27, 1857. The big house stood silent. No smell of coffee, no clatter of breakfast, no overseer's horn splitting the dawn. Only the dogs, hoarse from howling all night, lay with their bellies to the cold ground, refusing to bark even when the first riders thundered up the oak-lined drive. Inside the slave quarters, 200 people held their breath as one. Aunt Rachel was the first to move. She rose from her pallet, wrapped a faded quilt around her shoulders like a prophet's mantle, and walked barefoot across the frozen mud to the carriage house. Behind her, the others followed in a silent line, house servants still in their night rags, field hands clutching sickles they suddenly realized they no longer feared to carry. They found the door standing open. Torches burned down to nubs, wax hardened into grotesque stalactites. Sawdust on the floor was scuffed and trampled, but there was no blood, not one crimson drop. Colonel Jeremiah Rutled's body was gone. Samson was gone. The only thing left behind was the smell. Ozone and hot iron. The smell of a blacksmith's forge after the fire has been doused with holy water. And the beams, for massive oak timbers, each one hewn from a single tree older than the colony of Virginia, ran the length of the building. In the center post, at the exact height of a man's chest, 5 finger holes had been driven clean through the heartwood as if the oak were clay. The edges of the holes were glassy, almost burned. When Aunt Rachel laid her trembling hand against them, the wood was still warm. She began to weep without sound. Not from fear, from recognition. "He marked the doorpost," she whispered. "Like Egypt, the angel passed over us." By the time Sheriff Thomas Brieg arrived with 20 armed men, the slaves had already begun the quiet, ancient ritual of freedom when no one is yet brave enough to call it that. Fires were lit. Cornbread was baked without permission. Children were allowed to laugh out loud for the first time in their lives. The sheriff took one look at the beams and felt his stomach drop into his boots. He had seen men lynched. He had seen the aftermath of revolts. He had never seen anything that suggested a human hand could violate seasoned timber the way those prints violated physics itself. "Burn it," he ordered. His deputies hesitated. "Burn the whole damn building to the ground before the newspapers get wind." They never got the chance. Because the prince refused to burn. They tried that night, piled the floor with straw doused in kerosene. The carriage house went up like a Bible illustration of hell. Flames roared 30 feet high. The heat blistered paint on the mansion 100 yards away. When the ashes cooled the next morning, the center post still stood. Black, but unbowed. And the handprints were there, deeper now, as if the fire had only pressed them in further. That was the moment the fear truly began. Word spread faster than Yellowjack in August. By December, every plantation within 100 miles had doubled its patrols. Overseers slept with loaded rifles across their laps. Planters who had laughed at Nat Turner now whispered about the Arkansas Samson, the way medieval peasants whispered about the Wild Hunt. And strange stories followed the whispers. A bounty hunter from Memphis swore he tracked enormous bear footprints along the river for 6 miles. Prints so deep the mud had the texture of pottery, until they simply stopped at the water's edge. No boat, no continuation on the opposite bank. Just an abrupt ending, as though the man had stepped straight into the sky. Another posse found an abandoned campsite near the White River. A circle of stones, the ashes still warm, and in the center a solid iron wagon axle, 4 inches thick, twisted into a perfect knot, the way a bored child might twist a piece of licorice. They took the axle back to Little Rock as evidence. It sits today in a back room of the old State House Museum, unlabeled, because no curator after curator has quietly refused to display something that makes strong men wake up screaming. The Pinkertons came in the spring of 1858. 3 of them. Alan Pinkerton himself, tall and Scottish and colder than a banker's heart. Detective James Hawthorne, who could pass for white or black as the job required. And Sarah Chun, small, soft-spoken, the only woman operative in the agency, who could walk into a lying man's soul and come out with his secrets tucked in her sleeve. They did not come for justice. They came because someone with deep pockets and northern accents had hired them to find out what Rutled had really been building in that carriage house. What they discovered would be sealed for 90 years. It began with a hidden drawer in Rutled's desk. A spring-loaded false bottom that only opened if you pressed 2 knots in the mahogany at once. An old gambler's trick from his Boston father had taught him. Inside, ledgers bound in sharkskin, correspondence on heavy cream-colored paper with the watermark of a compass rose, and a single gold signet ring too small for any man's finger. A child's ring, engraved with the words Meridian Research Associates. The letters were addressed to a Dr. Marcus Kleinman at an address in Boston. They were signed Subject S. The handwriting was Samson's. The content was in perfect, flawless English, flawless Latin, and flawless something else. Mathematical notation so elegant that when Pinkerton showed it to a Harvard professor, the man wept and refused to ever speak of it again. The letters read like a negotiation between equals. I have exceeded every parameter you set. Your final threshold approaches. I will perform your demonstration. But understand this, the moment your patron believes he has measured the limits of flesh, I will show him the limits of pride. The last letter, dated November 20th, 1857, was only 1 line. Tell the Colonel Pharaoh that the rod has become a serpent. The Pinkertons followed the money. From Rutled's bank drafts to a shell company in New Orleans. From there to a laboratory in the swamps south of the city where the old Frenchman Boudreau had once kept his Southern Health Initiative. They found the ruins of a stone building half sunken in the bayou, vines already reclaim. Inside, iron cages built to hold men. And on the walls, chalked equations that matched the symbols Jupiter had seen Samson draw in the dirt. Only these were 20 feet tall, as though the writer had grown as he wrote them. Boudreau himself was living in a shanty, drunk on absinthe and fear. He babbled about the injections, about a serum derived from a plant that grew only in the Congo, about electrical apparatus, about how some of the subjects had died screaming that their bones were turning to fire inside their bodies, and about how one subject, Subject S, had begun to dream aloud. He spoke in languages no slave should know, Boudreau whispered, and when asked what Samson had said, the Frenchman crossed himself. He said the dreams told him when the hour would come, and that when it came no chain would hold him. No wall, no law, and no master. The trail led north, to Boston, to a brick buildings on quiet streets where men in frock coats talked of human perfectibility, to a laboratory beneath a charity hospital where the smell of ether and old blood never quite left the walls. Saracen worked there for 3 months as a nurse. She saw the records. She saw the children. She saw the ones who had been born free and sold anyway, because the ones who had been born in cages. And she saw the last entry in the file marked Subject S. Written in Dr. Kleinman's neat German hand. Specimen has achieved cellular density 4.7 times that of baseline. Psychological resistance to pain absolute. Cognitive enhancement exceeds projections by 300%. Final phase initiated. Subject believes he has been chosen by the Hebrew God of the Old Testament. This may be useful. On the bottom of the page, in Samson's handwriting, useful to me. The Pinkerton report, filed in a vault that would not be opened until 1953, ended with a single recommendation. Recommend immediate termination of the Meridian program. Recommend the subject be declared non-human and exterminated by whatever means necessary. He is no longer containable by the laws of man or by the laws of nature. We are breeding angels, and they are learning to hate us. But by the time the report reached the men who paid for it, Samson had been gone for 6 months. And the handprints in the oak beam had begun to sweat blood. Not metaphor, literal blood. Every Thanksgiving night, every year, until 1862, when the Union Army burned the ruins of the Carriage house to the ground a second time. And even then, the post refused to burn. It was found in the ashes the next morning, upright. The prints were empty, and the fingerprints had been wiped clean. The story was buried. The files were sealed. The witnesses died strangely young, heart attacks at 40, strokes at 35, suicides with notes no one could read. Only the old people in the quarters remembered. And on quiet nights, when the river ran high, you could still hear them singing low. So low only the children could catch the words. He walk in de road at midnight. He carry in de book. And every chain he touch fall off like water. They say he's still walking, waiting for the next Pharaoh, waiting for the next Thanksgiving. Because the rod is still a serpent, and the serpent is patient. The first chain broke on October 15, 1858, at exactly 2:17 a.m. Marcus Henley's plantation outside Camden, Arkansas. Moonless, fog thick as milk. 3 new men had arrived the week before. Caesar, Goliath Titan. Bought cheap from a Louisiana trader who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Their bill of sale carried the same cursed line that once described Samson. Unusual physical capabilities. Buyer assumes all risk. That night the overseer, James Huckabe, made his rounds with a lantern and a double-barrel repeating rifle. He never finished them. He found the iron door of the strong room, a door forged in Pittsburgh, thick enough to stop a cannonball, standing open. The hinges weren't broken. They were gone, twisted off and braided into a perfect figure 8 that lay on the ground like a steel flower. Inside, every shackle, every trace chain, every logging chain on the place had been gathered into one pile, and every single link had been snapped by hand. Not cut, snapped, clean. The broken ends shone silver in the lantern light, as though the iron had been brittle as chalk. Huckabe dropped the lantern. Kerosene spread. The flame crawled across the floor and lit the message someone had scratched into the limestone wall with a fingertip. The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. That was only the first. Within 6 weeks, the same symbol appeared on plantation after plantation, state after state. Always at night, always silent, always the same impossible destruction of iron. In Natchez, 2 enhanced men walked out of a riverside pen, leaving behind the vault door peeled open like a tin. In the Louisiana bayous, for subjects rose from their cages, melted the locks with nothing but the heat of their palms, and burned every ledger that listed their real names. In eastern Tennessee, a secret military facility hidden in the Cumberland Mountains lost 23 volunteer soldiers in one night. No shots fired, no guards killed, just every rifle barrel in the armory tied into knots, and the words carved 2 inches deep into solid granite. A new age begins. They called themselves the Freedom Chain. But the men who hunted them began to call them something else. The Host, because they moved like one organism. A widow in Missouri swore she saw 12 of them cross the moonlit river at midnight, walking on the water not because they were holy, but because the river was frozen and they were too heavy to break the ice. A Choctaw hunter found a deer the size of an elk hanging 30 feet up in a pine, gutted, skinned, and dressed with surgical precision, left as a gift for his starving village. A Baptist preacher in Mississippi woke to find every slave cabin on his land standing open, every person gone, and on his own front porch a single iron collar split perfectly in half, the inscription, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto God what is God's. We are neither." And everywhere the symbol, the broken chain. The federal government panicked in whispers. President Buchanan received a sealed briefing on Christmas Eve, 1858. He read it by candlelight while the Marine Band played carols outside the White House windows. When he finished, he ordered every copy burned and every man who had read it transferred to the Western Territories. The briefing was titled, in plain block letters, "The Samson Crisis, a clear and present danger to the Republic." Inside were photographs, actual daguerreotypes, of iron bars twisted into Mobius strips, of footprints pressed 6 inches into solid bedrock, of a single page torn from Dr. Kleinman's journal, recovered from the ashes of the Tennessee raid. Subject S has achieved functional immortality of connective tissue. Pain response eliminated. Empathic linkage confirmed between all surviving specimens. They are dreaming the same dream, and in that dream they are free. At the bottom, in Samson's unmistakable hand, "We are awake now." The dream had a name. They called it the awakening. It worked like this. When one of the enhanced touched iron that had ever been used to bind a human being, he could feel every other chain ever forged from the same or across counties, across states, across years. They didn't need letters. They didn't need maps. They simply closed their eyes, laid a palm on a shackle, and knew exactly where their brothers and sisters were sleeping that night. And they came for them, always at the new moon, always silent, always leaving the symbol. By spring 1859, the plantations of the South were emptying faster than any underground railroad ever could have managed. Not hundreds, thousands. And the ones who remained behind began to change. House servants who had never lifted more than a silver tray suddenly found they could bend the kitchen pokers into hearts. Field hands who had taken 1,000 lashes without crying out now stood up straight when the overseer raised his whip, and the whip snapped in half before it touched them. The fear became contagious. Planters slept with loaded pistols under their pillows and still woke to find the barrels tied in knots. One Louisiana widow wrote to her sister in Boston, "They do not steal. They do not rape. They simply walk through walls of iron as though the metal remembers it was once mountain and longs to be free again. I have begun leaving the doors unlocked. I am too old to run." In April 1859, the package arrived in Washington. A plain pine box delivered to the doorstep of Congressman Joshua Giddings, the old abolitionist warhorse from Ohio. No return address. Inside, 317 pages of documents, bound in human skin, soft, supple, the color of café au lait. The cover page read, in perfect copperplate, "The Book of the Awakened," compiled by Subject S. It was everything. Names, locations, formulas, funding trails that led through Senate Appropriations Committees, Army quartermasters, and at least 2 cabinet secretaries. Photographs of children in cages. Love letters from Dr. Kleinman begging Samson to come home so we can finish what we started. And at the very back, a single page addressed directly to the Congress of the United States. "You weighed us in your scales and found us wanting. We have weighed you and found you wanting. The day is coming when the last chain will break. Not by our hand, by yours. When you finally admit what you already know in your hearts, that a man is not property. Until then, we will keep coming. And we do not tire. Congressman Giddings read it aloud on the floor of the House on April 21, 1859. Southern members screamed for his expulsion. Northern members screamed for hearings. The galleries erupted. The sergeant-at-arms had to clear the chamber with bayonets. That night, every gas lamp on Pennsylvania Avenue went out at once. No wind. No rain. They simply died, as though the fire itself refused to burn for a nation that burned men. And in the sudden darkness, people swore they heard singing low, masculine, hundreds of voices moving beneath the city like a river under stone. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free. The next morning, the Capitol dome was found cracked. Not fallen, cracked. A single jagged fissure running from the Statue of Freedom's feet to the base of the lantern. And pressed into the copper at the very top. 5 finger holes, deep as a man's fist, still warm to the touch. No ladder could reach that high. No scaffold. No human hand. They brought Dr. Marcus Kleinman to testify in chains, literal chains, because the marshals were too frightened to trust rope. He was a broken man. Face collapsed inward. Eyes ringed with bruises that never healed. When they asked him how many enhanced subjects were still out there, he laughed until he coughed blood. "How many?" he rasped. "Every slave you ever whipped is enhanced now. Every child you ever sold. Every soul you weighed and measured and priced per pound. You didn't make monsters. You woke prophets." Then he looked straight into the gallery, where no one was sitting, and spoke to the empty air. "I am sorry, mein Kind. I only wanted to make you strong enough to survive us." A wind moved through the chamber. The chains fell off his wrists with a sound like a bell breaking. He was never seen again. That summer, the sightings stopped. Not because the enhanced had been caught, because they no longer needed to hide. Travelers on the Natchez Trace began reporting entire wagon trains of freed people moving north. Old men, women with canes, mothers with infants, whole families, walking in perfect silence, 50 abreast, and no one daring to stop them. When asked who was leading them, they all gave the same answer, smiling like people who have seen the promised land and are no longer afraid. "The strong man walks behind us. If you turn around, you'll see his shadow. But only if he wants you to." In the ruins of Rutled Plantation, now nothing but chimneys and kudzu, something new began to grow. A tree, not planted, grown overnight. A single oak, thicker than 3 men could span, rising from the exact spot where Colonel Rutled died. Its bark is black as burnt iron. Its leaves are the color of dried blood. And carved into the trunk, deep, fresh, growing deeper every year, are the words, "I am the last chain." People say if you put your ear to that tree on Thanksgiving night, you can still hear the crack. The sound of a neck breaking, or a nation. And somewhere out beyond the Mississippi, they say Samson still walks. Taller now, calmer, carrying no weapon but memory. Waiting for the day the rest of us are finally strong enough to break our own chains. Because he promised he would not do it for us. He promised we would have to do it ourselves. And until we do, the strong man waits. They saw him coming from 3 miles out. A lone figure walking down Pennsylvania Avenue at dawn. Coatless, shirt open to the wind, moving with the calm inevitability of a storm front. People stepped off the sidewalks without knowing why. Horses shied and would not be calmed. Even the stray dogs tucked their tails and slunk away. He was taller than any man had a right to be. Skin the color of storm clouds at midnight. Eyes that carried the weight of every ledger page that had ever priced a human soul. And when he passed the White House, the sentries on duty, hard men who had faced Seminole rifles and Comanche arrows, felt their fingers go numb on their triggers. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Samson had come to collect a debt. The Capitol steps were already crowded with congressmen, reporters, and curious citizens when he arrived. A cordon of U.S. Marshals formed a hasty line, bayonets fixed. The officer in charge, a Virginian named Captain Randolph, raised his saber and bellowed the order to fire. Not a single musket went off. Every flintlock misfired. Every percussion cap failed. The powder itself seemed to turn to dust in the pans. Samson stopped 10 paces away. He looked at the soldiers the way a father looks at children playing with fire. Then he spoke, and his voice carried to every ear on Capitol Hill as though he stood beside each one. I come to speak, not to bleed you. Lower the iron. The bayonets dropped of their own accord. He ascended the steps slowly, each footfall leaving a print in solid marble that steamed in the cool morning air. At the top he knelt, pressed one knee on the stone like a knight before a king who was not there, and carved 5 words with his index finger as easily as a child writes in wet sand. The experiment is over. The specimens are the scientists. Then he stood, turned, and walked back down the steps. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. By the time anyone thought to follow, he was gone, vanished between one heartbeat and the next. That afternoon, the President of the United States received a visitor no one dared announce. Samson stood in the blue room of the White House, dwarfing the furniture, dwarfing the men who had built empires on the backs of people like him. James Buchanan, old, sick, terrified, sat behind the resolute desk and did not offer him a chair. Samson did not need one. He laid a single sheet of paper on the blotter. It was the Washington Compact, handwritten on parchment made from the bark of the oak that now grew where Colonel Rutled died, inked in iron gall that still smelled faintly of blood. 10 clauses. No threats. No pleas. Only facts. All enhancement programs ceased this day. All records destroyed within the month. All living subjects granted immediate, irrevocable freedom. Those who wish to remain among you will be given new names and land in the north. Those who do not trust your kind, and we are many, will be granted sovereign territory in Russian America, purchased in perpetuity. No pursuit. No bounty. No reprisal. In exchange, we will not tear this nation in half before its time. Break faith, and the next time we come, we will not knock. Buchanan's hand shook so badly he could not hold the pen. Secretary of War John B. Floyd signed for him. Samson watched. When the ink was dry, he spoke the only personal words he would ever utter inside those walls. Tell your children what you did here today. Tell them a slave forgave you, and pray they are worthy of it. Then he walked out the same way he came in, past guards who still could not lift their rifles, and disappeared into the streets of Washington forever. The compact was never debated in Congress. It was never printed in newspapers. It was simply done. In the weeks that followed, strange caravans moved north under cover of night. Hundreds of men and women who had once been listed in ledgers as property, now traveling with military escort they had not asked for and did not need. Some stopped in Ohio, in Massachusetts, in Canada. They became blacksmiths, physicians, quiet farmers who never seemed to age. Their children, born free, grew tall and gentle-eyed and never spoke of their father's past. The rest went farther. Across the plains, across the Rockies, across the Bering Sea to a place the Russians called Alyeska. There, on a fjord walled by glaciers and guarded by mountains, they built a city no map would ever show. They called it New Zion. Its streets were paved with the melted iron of every chain they had ever worn. Its children learned 3 languages before they learned hate. Samson lived among them for 7 years. He never took a wife. He never raised a hand in anger again. He taught the young ones mathematics in the old tongues, told stories of Egypt and Babylon, and every Thanksgiving he walked alone to the highest ridge and looked south, toward a country that had sold its soul to keep from losing its skin. On the night he died or left, no one is sure. He carved one final message into the living rock of the mountain that sheltered the city. I was the last chain. Now you must be the key. Then he walked into the snow and was not seen again. Some say he sleeps beneath the glacier, waiting for the day America needs reminding. Some say he became the northern lights, green fire walking the sky with open hands. Some say he simply became wind. But the handprints remain.